out today. My name is Rob Metcalf from the Philosophy Department at UCD, and I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker. We'll be hearing a talk today from Professor Andrew Fiala from Fresno State University in California. Professor Fiala is author of a number of books relevant to our topic today. A few years ago, he published a book, Practical Pacifism. Since that time, he has written Tolerance and the Ethical Life, and most recently, a book on Jesus, the title of which is What Would Jesus Really Do? Today, we're going to hear him speak on this issue of From Jesus to George W. Bush. Please join me in welcoming to our campus Professor Fiala.
Thanks, Rob. And thanks to the Philosophy Department here for having me. Rob mentioned that title of this newest book, What Would Jesus Really Do? I didn't think up that title. The marketing department thought that one up. The title of that book, actually the book is about critically thinking about the biblical tradition and applying kind of philosophical ethics, humanistic ethics to the Bible. So that's kind of what's going to happen in this talk here today. I want to, instead of what would Jesus do, I kind of want to approach this talk from the perspective of what would Socrates do. Rob, when I told him WWSD, he said, what would Scooby do? Might be what we're talking about here, but what would Socrates do? And you need to know that I come to this topic as a philosopher from a philosophical standpoint. I'm not a preacher, I'm not a politician, I'm not here to convert you, to energize you politically. Rather, what we want to do is think critically about these issues. And you can see from the title, From Jesus to George W. Bush, what a long, strange trip that's been. There's some big issues here. It's quite an ambitious topic. We won't be able to talk about everything in the next 45 minutes or so. But again, what I want to inspire you to do is to think critically about these issues. As we begin, I'd like to just remind us all to be careful about, letting our ideas get away from us. There's a tendency in thinking about war and peace, there's a tendency to deal in abstractions. And it's inevitable in a way. We want to deal with isms and ists like pacifism or just war, ism, that's a thing. But there's also a tendency for us to lose track of the concrete reality of what we're talking about. So what I want to start out with, I want to talk about casualties in the war on terrorism. And just kind of out of curiosity, does anybody here have any idea about how many people have died in the last 5 years or so?
Tens, thousands, hundreds of thousands.
Tens of thousands?
Tens or hundreds of thousands, I'm not sure.
Yeah, not sure. Anyone have a good idea about this? Yeah.
I read recently 650,000 was one estimate.
This is the latest estimate in the Lancet, published in the Medical Journal. Most of us, a few of you have an idea about this, most of us have no clue, or we're not paying close enough attention. How about, does anyone know how many American service personnel have died?
About 20, almost 3,000.
Almost 3,000, probably around 2,700 in Iraq and 300 or 400 in Afghanistan. Just to think about being aware of abstractions, being careful about our abstractions. When we start talking about these numbers, it's real easy to just say, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. These are real people who are dead. They have children, they have parents, brothers and sisters, jobs. It's easy to deal with numbers and talk about numbers, but we're talking about real people here. As you probably know, or probably remember, 5 years ago, around 3,000 people were killed on September 11th on the attacks on the World Trade Center and on the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. As a result of those attacks, we invaded Afghanistan in October of 2001, just about exactly 5 years ago. And subsequent to the invasion, here's the numbers. You'll see there's a range here, 1,300 to 400,000 civilians killed. One of the problems is we know quite well how many of our guys have died, but we don't know in any detail how many of the bad guys or the others, or however we want to describe them, have been killed. And one of the reasons for this is we keep close track of American people who died, but we don't really seem to register or take that careful account of non-Americans who died in these battles. Somewhere around 10,000 enemy combatants have been killed. You probably noticed in the last few months, there's been an increase in casualties in Afghanistan. The war is kind of ratcheting back up now. In Iraq, you probably know the history about this. March of 2003, we invaded. The initial invasion was over pretty fast. And since then, we're seeing, there was a kind of a period of stability somewhat, and since then we're seeing casualty numbers increase as kind of civil war is breaking out there in Iraq. Over 2,700 Americans have been killed. Over 200 coalition troops have been killed. This number about Iraqi military killed, there's a range, that's a pretty wide range, from 5,000 to 30,000. Again, one of the problems here is no one's keeping that close account on what's happening on the other side. The 30,000 number, General Tommy Franks at one point threw that number out there. The next number in terms of civilians killed, 43,000 to 48,000. This number comes from the IraqBodyCount.org project. You can find it on the web, IraqBodyCount.org. The range goes from 43,000 to 48,000. It increases daily. We saw this last weekend, about over 100 people were killed in Iraq just in the last couple of days. The estimate that's on the Iraq Body Count Project website, you may know about this, but I'll tell you the methodology. What they do is they look for published media accounts of civilian casualties in Iraq. If the account is found in two places, if there's two separate independent media outlets that reported that, they recorded an account. As we mentioned back here, the Lancet article, there's actually two articles published in the medical journal, the Lancet. I'll point you down here in a second, these last two facts. The authors of these articles in the Lancet used a different methodology. It wasn't about published deaths. What they did is they went out and did social science kind of survey method. They did cluster sample methodology. In 2004, they came up with around 100,000 deaths as a result of the war. And just this last summer, they concluded another survey and published the results about a week ago, and they said there was somewhere between 600 and 650,000 people killed in Iraq as a result of the war. One difference, one important thing to note about this last set of figures is there's no attempt to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants in the Lancet article. So in terms of the abstraction, in terms of the numbers that are killed in the war, some totals, low-end estimates put the numbers of dead somewhere between 65,000 and 150,000. If we take that most recent Lancet article that says upwards of 650,000 people have been killed, high-end estimates push upwards to 670,000. 500,000 people killed in war on terrorism. So the question that we're going to try to talk about here today is whether or not these deaths can be justified. It might be the case, and the just war tradition gives us some resources to fill in this case. It might be the case that 500,000 deaths are justifiable. I'm going to remember the title of the talk from Jesus to George W. Bush. I'm going to try to remind you in a second here about the Christian pacifist tradition, which worries that, wow, that's a real high number, 650,000 people dead. The pacifists would say this gives us another reason to disavow war. This war is resulting in all kinds of horror. So how might these deaths be justifiable? Well, we need to step back and examine the Bush Doctrine in U.S. foreign policy. There's, by the way, you probably know some of this. People claim that American foreign policy has been hijacked by a neoconservative cabal that has some much larger purpose in mind. I'm not going to talk about any of that analysis, but I just want to remind you that this is American foreign policy, the Bush Doctrine. Whether you think it came from some neoconservative think tank or not, this is American foreign policy that we're talking about here. And in fact, it has links to a larger story about America's role in the world, as we'll see in a moment. Anyway, after the September 11th attacks, 2001, President Bush threw this remark out, kind of an offhand, off-the-cuff remark. He said, this crusade is going to take a while. People, of course, jumped all over him for using the word crusade, which is an inflammatory word to use, especially when we're talking about a Christian nation fighting against so-called Islamo-fascists. The Bush administration, they've been very careful not to use the word crusade since this time. It's an open question whether it is a crusade and how we want to interpret that. We might have a chance to talk about that more further. Notice he says it's going to take a while. That was 2001. 2006, this is in his radio address 2 weeks ago, President Bush says, we're in the early hours of a long struggle for civilization. 5 years in, we're still in the early hours of this long struggle. Again, here's the story that's being told here, is that this long struggle is a struggle against people who are intent on destroying Western civilization. And President Bush and his advisors have tried to tie this into the struggles of the 20th century against totalitarianism, both the Nazi threat and the communist threat, and now the Islamo-fascist threat. Let me direct our attention to policy, explicit policy of the United States. In 2002, so this is after the invasion of Afghanistan, in 2002 the National Security Strategy of the United States articulated ideas about how best to prosecute the war on terrorism. This document, the National Security Strategy, was updated in 2006, but more or less the same ideas apply in both the 2002 and the 2006 version. A new idea presents itself here, and this idea is kind of a new addition to understanding justice in war. Let me just read this section from the National Security Strategy. It says, as was demonstrated by the losses on September 11, 2001, mass civilian casualties is the specific objective of terrorists, and these losses would be exponentially more severe if terrorists acquired and used weapons of mass destruction. Again, think back, 3,000 people killed on September 11, 2001. What if they had a nuclear or biological weapon? The numbers would be 30,000, 300,000. The numbers would be a lot higher. The United States has long maintained the option of preemptive actions to counter a sufficient threat to our national security. The greater the threat, the greater is the risk of inaction, especially again if they get weapons of mass destruction and can blow up a city somehow. Then to do nothing would be to just invite kind of horrifying consequences for citizens of the United States. The greater the threat, the greater is the risk of inaction. And the more compelling the case for taking anticipatory action to defend ourselves, even if uncertainty remains as to the time and place of the enemy's attack. This last point points us towards a kind of what I would call speculative war, preemptive wars that are launched when we're not even totally certain about the nature of the threat. And yet, the argument being made here is that if terrorists get a hold of weapons of mass destruction, to wait until they attack would be to wait too long. Preemptive war is the new idea articulated in the policy of the United States. Last bit about President Bush, and then I'll sum up this discussion of the Bush Doctrine. On the 4th of July 2006, President Bush said this: "We are engaged in a global struggle against the followers of a murderous ideology that despises freedom and crushes all dissent and has territorial ambitions and pursues totalitarian aims." The word totalitarian here is used strategically to remind us of the struggles of the 20th century against Nazism, against communism, and in his speech and in other documents, the President has made this connection explicit. He goes on to say, "And against such an enemy, there is only one effective response. We will never back down, we will never give in, and we will never accept anything less than complete victory." Never back down, never accept anything less than complete victory. It's a bold and aggressive statement. Nothing less than complete victory. We'll talk about whether that's an acceptable idea or not. Clearly, the rhetoric is used to inspire people and to get us motivated to fight this war. But even the just war tradition worries that the talk about unconditional surrender and total victory can push us towards all kinds of injustice in fighting against enemies that can only be defeated in that way. So let me sum up this section talking about the Bush Doctrine. 4 basic principles of the Bush Doctrine. First is the idea that we are engaged in a clash of civilizations, a struggle against a totalitarian ideology that wants to annihilate our way of life, and that the only acceptable outcome is unconditional surrender on their part. First idea. Second idea is the idea that retaliatory defense and deterrence are inadequate to deal with terrorism, to work against terrorism, and so the new idea of preemptive war, the idea that we got to strike first before they strike us. Third point is the claim that the United States has a kind of moral mandate, a kind of moral superiority that allows us to act in unilateral fashion against threats around the globe. And the last point is the idea that liberal democracies are inherently peaceful and stable. And this last point is related to the rationale that's given for these wars that says, well, not only are we defending ourselves against terrorism, but we're also making democracy possible in Afghanistan and Iraq. Okay, these again, as I said, this is the policy that's motivating U.S. foreign policy right now. Now, let's back up 2,000 years. So we understand where the war on terrorism is coming from. What I'm going to do now is tell you a story that goes from Jesus on through the just war tradition and kind of return us back to George Bush at the end. Many of you probably know that there's a pacifist narrative embedded in the Christian New Testament. One of the difficulties for understanding Christian pacifism is that it develops out of warrior culture. If you look at the Old Testament text, the books, the Mosaic text, you look at Exodus or the book of Joshua, you find the idea of holy war right there in the midst of the tradition. You look at the book of Joshua, for example, I was talking about this at lunch, there's this idea that in order to retake the Holy Land, anything goes, including exterminating all the evil enemies. And at one point in Joshua, God commands the sun to stand still in the sky so that the slaughter can proceed, so that the Hebrews can retake the Holy Land. Then along comes Jesus, who says all these crazy things that run counter to this idea of holy war, including this one, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Before I read this passage, let me remind you a historical bit about understanding New Testament texts. Jesus was living in the 1st century, and the texts that we're going to talk about here were written down a generation or two after Jesus died. The context there matters. This was a context where Romans were occupying the Hebrew lands, and there was an ongoing worry among Jews about the use of violence. Some Jews took up the sword and fought back against the Romans. And in year 70, I think it's year 70, the Romans fought back and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. The negative side of violence is kind of exposed in 1st century history. Jesus and Christian pacifism makes sense, I think, within that context. Rather than saying, let's take up the sword against our oppressors, Jesus says, let's try something different. Because clearly taking up the sword isn't working. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says this, love your enemies, which is a strange idea. Love your enemy. Do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. To him who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also, and from him who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. And as you wish that men would do you, do so to them. That last bit, that's the golden rule, right? And it appears that the golden rule is being applied in a way that takes in even the enemy. Rather than kill the enemy, we should learn to love the enemy. Which, again, is kind of a strange idea, especially if you come up in a culture that says, well, enemies are those who should be hated and despised, exterminated, and destroyed. That's the Gospel of Luke. There's a parallel text in the Gospel of Matthew, the Sermon on the Plain in Luke, the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. Jesus says this, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Here he's quoting the Old Testament text, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, the lex talionis idea. He goes on to say, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. Which again is kind of a crazy idea. Do not fight back against the one who is evil. Love your enemies and don't fight back. This is the heart of Christian pacifism. One last bit to remind you about this, of this story. Jesus not only says these things, but he lives them. He kind of exemplifies certain virtues. Virtues like forgiveness, love, tolerance, mercy, peacefulness. And the famous scene at the end of Jesus' life when he's arrested, some of his disciples want to fight against the bad guys who come to arrest them. Jesus says, put your sword back away. In the Gospel of Luke, in the version of Luke, there's actually a little scuffle, and one of the bad guy's ears gets cut off. And Jesus reaches out and heals the ear, restores his enemy to health. In terms of the example set here, the example is clearly don't fight back, but give in, submit, even to unjust authority who has nothing but negative things to, nothing but negative consequences for you. Now, Christian pacifism develops as a tradition of its own through the history of Christianity. We could talk, there's a lot of details to be filled in here. There's Nino Simmons, the founder of the Mennonites. There's the Amish. We saw some examples of Amish pacifism a couple weeks ago in regard to the schoolyard shootings in Amish country. There's the Quakers. There's Catholic versions of Christian pacifism. Let me skip to the end of the 19th century, in part because this history will tie back into American history. Start with Tolstoy. In 1884, Tolstoy, who's the author of War and Peace and some Anna Karenina and his novels, Tolstoy articulates a version of Christian pacifism, which is a non-resistant kind of pacifism. Do not resist evil, he says. He says Jesus means this very seriously. You got to take it seriously. Love your enemy and do not resist the one who's evil. He says, he's quoting these texts which is read, he says, Jesus was saying that when we are doing our best not to fight against evil people, there will be times when they will hit us again and again. There will be times when they will take our coat and our shirt too. There will be times when they will ask us for things and not give them back. But in all of this, we should be clear that we will not hit back. We must not stop loving our enemies, for doing this is the only way to truly change the evil in the world. That's an interesting claim. Not fighting back, not fighting against evil, is the only way to fight against evil, is what he's saying. That's an interesting idea. There's a bunch of complicated metaphysics involved here, I think. There's some idea about a larger spiritual structure of the universe and how that larger spiritual structure will come to our aid when we don't resist evil, and so on. Tolstoy then says this was kind of his conversion epiphany when he realized that Jesus actually meant this. Don't fight back. A few years later, Tolstoy entered into a correspondence with Gandhi. And in this letter to a Hindu, where he's addressing Gandhi, he says the following. You notice the word love comes in here. Remember, Jesus says, love your enemies. Here the word love comes back again. We'll see love again in a second. Tolstoy says, love and forcible resistance to evildoers involves such a mutual contradiction as to destroy utterly the whole sense and meaning of the conception of love. If one has a theology of love, one cannot resist the evildoer, says Tolstoy. So he concludes, do not resist the evildoer and take no part in doing so, either in the violent deeds of the administration, in the law courts, the collection of taxes, or above all in soldiering. And no one in the world will be able to enslave you. Notice here, Tolstoy says, don't participate in government, don't take anyone to court to sue to get your things back, and definitely don't become a soldier. Christians should not participate in any of those things. Why? Again, out of love. Love does not prosecute evil. Love accepts it, tolerates it, and does not resist it. Now, I mentioned Tolstoy was in correspondence with Gandhi. We can talk about Gandhi, but it'll take us on a tangent that leads us away from Christian pacifism. Anyway, Gandhi adopted some ideas from Christianity, modified those to his own unique cultural standpoint. And 50 or 60 years later, Martin Luther King took up the idea of Christian pacifism, influenced by Gandhi and thus indirectly by Tolstoy. Martin Luther King says this in his Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. He's talking about love here again. He says, in the final analysis, love, the word agape, means recognition of the fact that all life is interrelated. All humanity is involved in a single process, and all men are brothers. To the degree that I harm my brother, no matter what he's doing to me, to that extent I'm harming myself. Interesting idea. You hear how the love of neighbor relates to the golden rule in this quote? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Here it's all connected in the idea that if you harm your neighbor, you actually harm yourself. So one should not do anything harmful to the neighbor. So let me sum up this brief rundown of Christian pacifism. I call it Christian pacifist view an absolute pacifist kind of view. Rob mentioned the title of my book is Practical Pacifism, which is not exactly absolute pacifism. I'm not committed to this view, in part because the metaphysics and the theology involved here require quite a leap of faith to believe as Tolstoy and King did. I can't quite make that leap myself. But anyway, here's the kind of concluding points about absolute pacifism. First of all, obviously war is never justified in absolute pacifism. Personal violence may be justified in a different way. I mean, if it's me fighting against a guy in the street, that could be different. But war cannot be justified, in part because it creates categories like enemy. It creates kind of hatred and an antagonism between us and them that just doesn't cohere with the idea of love. Second point, transcendent values such as peace and love and virtues such as mercy and forgiveness, all these ideas are way more important to the Christian pacifist, the absolute pacifist, way more important than ideas like patriotism, short-term gain, self-interest. The absolute pacifist reminds us that there are other more important things to be concerned with in life. Which leads us to the third point. The absolute pacifist is not concerned with the question whether pacifism is effective. That is, whether it's effective in the short term. There's an idea that it might be effective in the great long run of things. And there's this last idea that the sacrifices made in the name of love will be compensated somehow. But the question of, will this solve our problem today, is of secondary interest to the absolute pacifist. Again, why? Because they're interested in a transcendent realm of value, in which short-term effectiveness simply doesn't matter. Okay, that's the pacifist part of the talk. Let me talk about the just war tradition. The word tradition is important here in terms of understanding what's going on. Tradition is an ongoing conversation. So in Christianity, for the last 2,000 years, there's been an ongoing conversation about the justification of violence. And one idea that's developed as a response to Christian pacifism is the idea of the just war. Now, here's I think, the basic idea that motivates the just war idea. And it's the worry or the claim that pacifism is not only idiotic, unuseful, but actually immoral. And here's how this argument goes. To not fight back against evil is to allow evil to continue and to flourish, which means that to not fight back is actually to facilitate and foster evil. But if evil is to be rejected, then damn it, we got to fight back, goes the critique of pacifism. Here's one version of this. This is Sam Harris, who, in this book, The End of Faith, he indicts Christianity, Islam. He says religion is a big problem in the world. And he also worries that religious pacifism is as much a problem as Islamofascism. There's some evidence to lead us towards the just war idea in the New Testament. I don't think you can find it in Jesus if you look at what Jesus says, but in Paul's letters, there's some idea about justice and war. And in the book of Romans, Paul's letter to the Romans, he says, more or less, I'll just paraphrase this quote, he says that the sovereign has the authority instituted by God to use the sword in order to protect the good and eliminate the evil. When the sovereign power uses his sword, he's doing it in God's name in order to further morality. That's in the book of Romans. And if we jump forward a few hundred years, we could talk about Augustine. In the City of God, Augustine lays out an idea of the just war. Read a couple of sentences here to show you what Augustine says. He says, surely if he remembers that he is a human being, he will lament the fact that he is faced with the necessity of waging just wars. For if they were not just, he would not have to engage in them, and consequently there would be no wars for a wise man. The key word there, and hold on to this because we'll return to it in a second, is the idea of lamenting the fact. The just warrior does not celebrate war, does not go to war excited about the adventure. The just warrior goes reluctantly, out of necessity, moral necessity, with a kind of tragic view of life that, damn it, I have to go fight. I'd rather not. I wish the world were a better place, but the world contains evil and it must be opposed. That's Augustine's basic idea of the just war. There's a lot more details to fill in here. We could talk about Aquinas and Suarez and Vittoria and a number of other people in the history of the West that clarified the just war idea, but let's leap to the present. Jean Bethke Elshtain, who is a professor at the University of Chicago, who was a former teacher of mine at Vanderbilt. She published a letter in 2002 as a response to and a justification for the invasion of Afghanistan. Notice the date here, 2002 is before the Iraq War. So the Iraq War may be a different concern here. But in this letter, which was signed by Elshtain, by Michael Walzer, by George Weigel, and a number of other prominent just war thinkers, the letter claims that there are times when waging war is not only morally permitted, but morally necessary as a response to calamitous acts of violence, hatred, and injustice. This is one of those times. Since she published this letter, the letter's been published further in a book called Just War Against Terrorism, which itself has created a kind of turmoil in the academic world. People have written all kinds of responses now to Elshtain, wondering how she could be a defender of the Bush administration. We might have a chance to return to that discussion here. So anyway, just war idea. You can respond to evil using violence. Even a Christian can respond to evil using violence. In fact, it may be a Christian's obligation to fight Paul Ramsey puts it this way, to fight in the name of love. Because out of love for our neighbors, we might have to kill some others of our neighbors in order to defend those we love. Some principles of the just war theory. Two big categories here. The first is jus ad bellum, or justice in thinking about going to war. Most important category here is the idea of just cause. There's got to be a just cause for the war. In the way the tradition puts this, war has got to be a response to evil. Now, in the modern period, this has been fleshed out in some more detail. Most contemporary just war theorists say that the just cause is a response to aggression, where national sovereignty is jeopardized. We can then use war to defend sovereignty. Some other conditions, the just warrior has to have the right intention. There's got to be legitimate authority. It's got to be a legitimate sovereign. War has to be a last resort, meaning that other non-violent means have got to be employed. And they've got to be employed more than once before the resort to war is justified. There's got to be a probability of success, and the war has got to be proportional. The goods expected have to be proportional to the harms that will be caused in war. That's justice in going to war. Second big category, jus in bello, or justice within war. Here, the just warrior has got to discriminate properly between combatants and non-combatants. You can't kill everyone. According to just war principles, some people have immunity from being killed. Innocent non-combatants cannot be killed. You have discrimination. Our means have got to be proportional. You can't blow up the city to get the general, right? There's certain things you just can't do because it creates disproportionate harm. And the last two, no intrinsically bad means can be employed, which means, for example, rape cannot be used as a weapon of war. You can't poison water supplies. There's certain actions that just cannot be used. Even if they might advance the war aim, those actions are so evil, you cannot use them. And the last bit about the War Convention, this is the idea that there are actually rules of war that have developed among professional soldiers in the last centuries, including the idea that prisoners of war ought to be respected and treated in certain ways. Okay? So big picture view of the just war theory, principles about going to war, and principles about how we should fight. So now we return to the war on terrorism, with that in mind. Again, what we've done. Christian pacifism, Jesus seems to say no war. The just war tradition which develops out of this, and now here we are fighting this war on terrorism using the Bush Doctrine, or employing the Bush Doctrine. We've got to think about some of these questions. And I'm sorry to say I don't have great answers to these questions. I have opinions, but the questions themselves open so much complexity that it's almost impossible to give a definitive answer here in 8 more minutes. And so I'm going to just throw out the questions, and hopefully we can talk about these in the discussion period. First, is what we're doing now in the war on terrorism a proportional response to the aggression that we witnessed on September 11th? Is it proportional? One thing we need to do to answer this question is weigh out the harms and benefits. Again, if we take the high number, 670,000 people killed in the war on terrorism, can those harms be justified in light of the other harms we're trying to protect? Harms we're trying to prevent. Second point, can preemptive war ever be justified? The Bush idea of preemptive war is a new idea in thinking about just war, the just war tradition. Now, the just war tradition contains an idea of preemptive war, but the standard for centuries was that the danger had to be imminent and clear. Remember, the national security strategy says that the danger can be kind of speculative. It can remain uncertain as to the way the danger is going to manifest itself, and yet we can preemptively attack. I'm worried about this one, that the preemptive war doctrine will lead to a kind of escalation of violence that can't be justified on just war principles. Third question is quite a vexing one. Can war be used to spread democracy and defend human rights? If we look at what's happening in Afghanistan and Iraq, it's not clear that war is a useful method for disseminating democracy. Yes, there's been elections and there's a constitution in place in Iraq, but we're also seeing chaos. We're also seeing the potential for civil war. How reasonable is it to believe that going in and blowing the place up will actually help to produce democracy? The just war tradition will be skeptical of this, I believe, and definitely the pacifist tradition will be skeptical of this. Last question here that I want us to think about is is the demand for unconditional surrender ever justified? We think back to the Second World War, where we saw the demand for unconditional surrender used against Japan. In order to achieve unconditional surrender and total victory, look what we had to do to Japan. We had to drop 2 atomic bombs. We killed hundreds of thousands of people. And it may not be the case that the just war tradition, as articulated in the last couple of millennia, can ever justify the demand for total victory. Now let me point you to my own point of view, and then I'll sum up, offer some conclusions. There's a version of the just war theory that actually becomes pacifism. And I'm sympathetic to this view, just war pacifism. This is the idea that the just war theory makes sense. Yeah, in theory you can fight back against evil. But in practice, especially the way that modern wars are practiced, it's not at all clear that any given war is just, according to the just war criteria. This idea of just war pacifism developed in the 70s and 80s by primarily Catholic thinkers who were worried that nuclear deterrence strategy was, on the face of it, immoral. Nuclear deterrence strategy, you aim to kill all the innocent civilians in the enemy country. In other words, the means you employ are deliberately immoral, and if that's the way modern wars have to be fought, just war pacifists said, forget it. The just war project is over. I'm sympathetic to that point of view. In my book, Practical Pacifism, I've explained that point of view in some further detail, and I've laid out what I call skeptical pacifism. The idea here, and where I come from with this, is the worry that ordinary citizens don't actually have enough information often to make good judgments about whether or not the just war theory is being employed. Again, here's kind of how I came to this realization. I was raised a Christian. I hear Jesus in the background of my thoughts saying, love your enemy, don't return evil. And yet I hear people saying we got to go and kill and destroy the evil enemy. How do I know what to do as an ordinary citizen? Who do I adhere to? What Jesus is telling me, or what the president and the politicians are telling me? Who do I trust? History gives us good reason to be skeptical of political authority. They manipulate information. They selectively emphasize certain things. The media manipulates us sometimes. Where I kind of end up with this is that it's perfectly reasonable to demand clear proof that war is required. And until that proof is crystal clear, it's perfectly reasonable to say no war, in practical pacifist view. Holds out the possibility that, yeah, war might be justifiable somewhere, in some circumstances. I mean, if the Canadians march down here with their hockey sticks and invade us, yeah, okay, well, we can take up arms and fight back. But what about these speculative wars that are articulated and described in the national security strategy, where the president says uncertainty about the time and place of the attack? What's an ordinary, non-expert citizen supposed to do? So, what can we learn from the pacifist heritage of the just war tradition? And I want to leave you with these thoughts about pacifism, partly because we hear so much about the just war idea. We hear very little about the pacifist idea. Just run through a few conclusions. Remember, the pacifist says that pacifism, the commitment to love of enemies, etc., the commitment to these kind of virtues, that it can be transformative, both of the self and of the culture. It's not concerned with effectiveness in the short term, but it's concerned with a larger kind of spiritual transformation. And in fact, it can be effective. If you look at the example of Gandhi, Martin Luther King, there's something to be said for the fact that creative and active nonviolence can actually change the world. Another conclusion. This is a worry that war should not be its own continued justification. My point here is that we're fighting. It's been 5 years since September 11th, 5 years since we invaded Afghanistan. It's very easy to say, well, we're fighting over there already. We got to keep fighting. War becomes its kind of own rationale. On the other hand, the pacifist tradition and the just war tradition reminds us that it's always appropriate to keep asking the question, are we done fighting yet? It's not cowardice, it's not weakness, it's some kind of moral seriousness that leads us to continue to ask this question. When can we put our swords back away? I'm worried about the rhetoric that says, because we're fighting, we should continue to fight. Next conclusory point. We should remember that war, and Augustine used this language, war is always to be lamented. It's always a tragic fact. What war shows us is that there is evil in the world. War shows us that there is injustice. War shows us the failures in human nature. It's easy to kind of buy into the Rambo kind of cultural myth that says that the warrior is noble and doing these wonderful things. By the way, I don't want to say that our soldiers are not making wonderful sacrifices, but these sacrifices are dark. We don't want people to have to make these sacrifices. We want some other kind of system in which war is not celebrated. And again, the Christian pacifist tradition reminds us that there are more important values, maybe love, mercy, tolerance, etc. Furthermore, if we reflect on what's happened in the last couple of 5 years, we should remember the kind of war fever that was generated prior to the invasion of Iraq, the manipulation of intelligence, deliberate or inadvertent, whether it was just ignorance or whether it was deliberate manipulation. It's hard to answer that question, but most of us were led to a war that most of us are now beginning to think was not justified in the first place, especially in Iraq. We need to be careful in the future because, as President Bush said, we're in the beginning of a long struggle for civilization. We're going to be asked to make further sacrifices for fight further wars. Syria, Iran, North Korea now. We've got to be very careful. And the skeptical stance that I articulate, we need to keep asking those kind of skeptical questions. How certain are we that now is the time to unfurl our weapons? Last point. I think we should be really careful about the language that is used that talks about the war on terrorism as a struggle for civilizations or a struggle for all time, this apocalyptic language. The danger of this language is that it points us towards the idea of unconditional surrender, total victory. If it is really a struggle for civilization, the only thing we can do is completely exterminate and destroy the evil enemy. That pushes us beyond the just war idea. The just war idea does not include this idea of exterminating the evil enemy. Last thing, and this points us back to the Bush Doctrine idea that the U.S. has a kind of unique moral responsibility in the world. Clearly we have a moral responsibility, but we need to be careful of the kind of blindness that comes when one claims that that you have the responsibility and you have kind of some insight into the moral structure of the universe such that you have the mandate then to go forward and use arms. That's it. Thank you for your patience.
We have time for questions and comments, and we have a microphone here.
If you have questions, come up to the mic.
If you look at U.S. actions from the Iraqi point of view, we invaded them and they had nothing to do with 9/11. Are they justified in fighting us?
According to just war ideas.
Yes, according to the just war ideas, are they justified in seeking war with the United States?
Yeah, well, if you understand the just cause idea as being, you can justifiably respond to aggression, and if the invasion is a kind of aggression, then certainly. Look just about the Iraq War. There's a much longer story here about what happened in Iraq. It didn't just begin on March 2003, right? You've got to trace this back to the 90s, the early 90s in the Gulf War, and the ongoing sanctions regime and the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, etc. I mean, if you want to talk about a much larger point of view, people have made this argument, well, we're continuing to fight Iraq because of the initial Iraqi aggression against Kuwait. It's quite a complicated story out there in terms of history of this. But your question, you're saying, are Iraqis justified in fighting against an occupying force? Here's a problem for just war theory. This is a problem. Can both sides in the conflict be justified? Can both sides have justice on their side? Most just war theorists want to say no. There's only one story about justice and it can only be held on one side. But on the other hand, if your country is invaded even by a just army, aren't you justified in taking up arms and fighting against them? It seems the answer to that might be yes, which is further complexity for the just war theory. Is it possible at all to talk about justice on both sides of the conflict?
I was just wondering if you'd comment, I know in Michael Walzer's book on Just War, the introduction to his new edition, he claims that Gulf War was a just war because Iraq had invaded a sovereign country and was now oppressing it. Would you make that same call?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. Again, this is the contemporary just war theory. Says that war can be justified as a response to aggression. And Walter fills in some of these details that, the specifics of Kuwait couldn't defend itself, right? And the Iraqi army marched in there, and there they were. So the rest of the world has a morally required to jump in and fight against aggression, right? So yeah, aggression is a primary cause for war, and it's not just up to the one who's aggressed against to defend itself, but anyone else can. I think the way Walter puts it, he says, whoever has the capacity should, right? Which means that the U.S. as a primary power on earth, we're required morally to go around the world and defend other countries against aggression.
Well, I was just wondering, the judgment call being we have a lot more at stake in terms of American national interest with regard to the Middle East than, say, Tibet. We're not marching over to Tibet to throw the Chinese out. And yet they, in the same way, absorb a sovereign nation.
Yeah. Now things get real complicated. If we start talking, remember one of the just war principles is that there's got to be the right intention. You suggest, and we hear a lot of this, you suggest that the U.S., that our intentions were not pure, either in the first response to Iraqi aggression in Kuwait or in the subsequent war on terrorism. How do we judge that? This is a real question for me. How do we know what the intentions are? This analysis that I'm giving here just talks about the overt rationale for the war. Talks about what President Bush has said in his public statements, talks about the national security strategy, the overt policy of the United States, which talks about defending justice. If you read the national security strategy, it's uplifting American civics language about how important liberty is and how America is kind of the city on the hill that has to uphold liberty and all these ideas. And yet, there's another story that can be told, right? What are the real intentions? Is it all about the oil? How do we know that? Is one question I have. This is kind of what would Socrates say? I don't know what the real intention is. We know what the overt explanation is. We know sometimes there's a contradiction or a conflict between the overt explanation and what the real intentions are. And yet, go back to Walzer. Walzer says about humanitarian intervention, he says, mixed motives are not such a bad thing in international affairs, as long as the end is obtained. This is Walzer's idea. And the idea behind this is, if the aggressor has got to be repelled, so what if self-interest also motivates it? As long as the just war outcome is obtained. What you said about Tibet, why we're not talking about China here. This has something to do with capacity. It has something to do with power differentials. Iraq is an easy target. We already, for 10 years or so, systematically taking apart their infrastructure. We knew we could march right in there, barrel over the place. Can we do this in China? Of course not. Right? Can we do it in North Korea, which is the one in the media right now? I don't know. But the circumstances are different in terms of power differentials.
I'll have a million questions. I'll limit it to one. And actually what might sound like a fairly specific one. And you talk about Tibet, but this is the 50th anniversary of the Hungarian Revolution, 1956. And it just shows that despite all rhetoric, bit of realism has never gone out of date when one acts, despite whatever the moral consequences are. The United States did the right thing by not intervening to help the Hungarians, though they did the wrong thing by encouraging them to revolt. So, very mixed bags. But specific question, there's all kinds of protracted conflicts and all of those things. We'll leave that aside. You mentioned Tolstoy, not a Tolstoy expert, but how do you explain this? Tolstoy seems to me to be a mixed bag. He often speaks against himself. And how is it that one of Tolstoy's great heroes that he wrote about, called kind of a mini Christ, was Abraham Lincoln? If you're supposed to turn the other cheek. How come he didn't do it? And how come he emerges as such a hero to Tolstoy, the man who hated heroes? He didn't use that term for him, but in fact wrote about heroes. So how does Lincoln enter into the picture? And why did we let the South secede?
Thank you. I don't know enough of the details about Tolstoy's view on Lincoln to answer,
Very positive.
to answer that specific question, but you point to a further, the further wrinkle in both thinking about Christian pacifism and Christian background here, thinking about the just war tradition. Notice, go back to this idea of what is a sovereign state and what is the role of the leader in a sovereign state. Is the job of the sovereign to keep the state together? That's an important and interesting question. What are the limits that the sovereign can use in order to fulfill that obligation? That is the sovereign's obligation. Can war be used as a means for keeping the state together? The just war tradition, things are going to get complicated. You've got to look at the details here. It's hard to generalize, I believe. It's hard to generalize and say, yeah, no one should ever be allowed to secede. That seems kind of silly. On the other hand, can war be used as a method to keep people together? I get the parallel when you start talking about Lincoln and the Civil War. I'm thinking about what's happening in Iraq right now and the potential for this to evolve into a kind of civil war. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And what should we do about it? I don't have a clear answer on that. But in order to think it through, you've got to get some principles clear, right? Getting back to proportionality and discrimination and all these just war principles. We've got to make sure if we make a choice one way or another, the choice happens justly, or as just as it can be. Again, I don't think the just war tradition gives us any really good method with which to deal with civil war or these other ideas. In part because the question of sovereignty is just taken for granted by just war theorists for the most part. They say, well, there's such a thing as sovereign nations. And what they're thinking about primarily is aggression between sovereign nations, not dissolution within a sovereign nation. So that's a great question. Thank you.
I understand that Tolstoy's Christian pacifism didn't give him an answer either, which is why he praised it. He had an answer.
Yeah. I mean, Christian pacifism doesn't give us many answers about who should we vote for. It reminds us of our obligations, but how these obligations play themselves out in the real world, I mean, it's quite complicated to figure out how that's going to work. Thank you.
This kind of just ties into what you just said, obligations in the real world. What do we do about it? I know that's kind of a broad question, but if you have any suggestions, because especially like with the current political climate, it seems that the platform of the Democrats is more the opposite of whatever the conservatives say than anything else, any new ideas or any of their own ideas. So what do we do?
What do we do, or what does, what do you do? This is, let me go back to where I started to talk about what would Socrates do. I don't know that this is helpful at all, but let me just tell you what the philosophy side of me wants to say about this. The first thing we do is think critically and carefully in a sustained fashion about what's happening in the world. This again, I kind of towards the end here, I point towards the rhetoric of the clash of civilizations and all the political manipulation, the media, and all this. One thing that's lacking is critical thinking. The more and better we can think about this, probably the better we'll do in the long run. Now, that's easy for us to say here on the university campus. Everyone nods, yeah, critical thinking will be a good thing. But we're all here doing education. What about the rest of the world and the voters, and how do we change a culture, and how do we push things in the right direction? That needs a politician to answer that question. I can cop out on that one as a philosopher. And I have ideas, but I don't want to tell you what they are because it's not philosophy anymore, it's political activism. The other side of this is, you might say, well, what do we do to create moral conversion in the world? This is the kind of preacher question, a religious question. How do we get people to think clearly about good and evil? How do we get them to understand, virtue and the commandments to not return evil? How do we get them to do this? They're getting preachers to tell you how to create this kind of transformation in the spirit. I don't have good answers about that. Again, back to the philosophy answer to this particular question. The more and better we can think about these ideas, and the more careful we are in our discourse, the hope is that will gradually have a ripple effect and will transform society. And just to offer a word of hope about this, 3 or 4 years ago, the rhetoric seemed to work. The war on terrorism, struggle of civilization rhetoric, it moved people. It doesn't move people quite as much anymore. Notice the rhetoric remains. Since 2006, President Bush is using the same rhetoric, but it doesn't seem to have quite as much of a motivational force, in part because now we've had time. 4 or 5 years in, we're thinking more and better about this. So again, what would Socrates do? Think. Thanks.
Can you discuss more maybe about how your practical or skeptical pacifism actually would then play out? You touched on it briefly, but you didn't really expand on the idea at all.
Yeah, well, in the book, I tie it into what I call democratic citizenship. And the idea here is, and I think this is, in the heart of the American tradition, the liberal tradition, that we are always entitled, and we should, question authority. Especially the more severe or serious the consequences of what authority is about to do, we need to ask more serious questions. So in terms of, effectiveness of practical pacifism or skeptical pacifism, I wanted to motivate kind of resistance to and questioning of authority. I've discussed this with my students. Students will also often say, well, so you're talking about treason or, betraying your country or something. It sounds like if we question and resist the authorities that we're un-American and unpatriotic. And, I hear that, but I want to reinterpret that back into the mainstream of American thought that it's actually the American citizen's duty to continue to question authority, continue to question government. Especially, and you can fill in a lot of details here, especially when you see the way that structures of authority have lied to us, manipulated us, not just in recent history, but we can go back to Vietnam. There is no good reason to trust what they say on the face of it. And you're always justified in asking questions. Tie into that, further claim about our culture, which is that our culture is permeated with militarism. It's the football teams playing last night, it's the war movies that we see on TV, it's the weapons in the hands of every third person, everyone has a gun, it's the cartoons, etc. You can talk a lot about the media and the culture. The practical pacifist side is to say, wait a minute, what the hell are we doing? Do we want all of our kids to be playing cops and robbers all the time? It's a larger critical approach that takes in government, takes in culture, and it reminds citizens of their obligation. And it's the kind of philosophy obligation to think better, to think harder, to criticize more. I don't know if that tells you. Yeah. Please.
Well, I'm all wrapped up in this. I love what you said about fighting more because we're fighting more and that not making any sense. But I feel like everything that's coming, it's like this violence begets violence. And it's like if we love them instead of violence, like the reason there's so much hatred towards us is because all these people have been living in violence. And then they got brought in with intelligence to foster that violence and make it a moving force. But what I'm saying is I know the only way that I can see that could ever change any of this would be just to get in there, into the poverty and into the violence and show people a better way. And I don't think that they want that from us as Americans, even if we are I don't stand for Bush, I don't believe what you believe, just the language barrier alone or anything do you think there's any nation or organization or anything out there that has the ability to counter with the same amount of power, the same amount of scope as what they're doing in the Middle East there or in any place? Is there any hope for that?
That's a huge one. You're asking, is there any power on earth that is more powerful than the American government? It's kind of what you're asking. And more powerful than the military machine. Is that what you're asking?
Not even, just even grassroots. I'm talking about in the Middle East, just how the Taliban can be, or even looking back to those totalitarian states of just people being well, would you love and bring peace to Hitler? And you're Hitler is a product of that environment. And if we didn't destroy the Germans and give them absolute and put that huge financial burden on them, he wouldn't come to power. But you can't turn back the clock. So what I'm saying is we have the ability to come out clean and police the entire world.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one. It's very important. I mean, on the one hand, what do we do now, right?
Yeah.
Do we pull our troops? You weren't saying this, but do we pull our troops out right now and leave chaos behind? Right? Or maybe not. Maybe they'll be glad we left. In the paper this morning, Al-Maliki, the Iraqi leader, said, Americans need to get the heck out of here, right? Because they're just contributing to the problem. They need to leave and let us take care of it ourselves. Which seems reasonable to me. You know, but on the other hand, there's this, you know, we broke it, we got to fix it thing. We have a responsibility to make things better and not just leave all of a sudden and just leave the vacuum. Then you're also reminding us that maybe there are, and this is the more subtle part of this, maybe there are responses and institutions and ideas that don't have to do with military power, that might be equally as transformative to the culture. And then you reminded us, thank you, that it's kind of odd for us sitting here to come up with ideas about them way over there. This us-them dichotomy is a tough one, we want to be careful of it, but we can't just go around the world and claim that we can solve other people's problems, whether it's through military force or through some other kind of nonviolent activism. And yet, let me offer maybe one bit of hope about this. There's got to be some kind of alternative to military power in terms of transforming the world. And one is probably religious power. I'm not religious myself. I'm raised in a religious tradition, but I know that there are committed individuals around the world who are working in the name of these kind of ideas, Christian pacifism ideas, and they're doing wonderful things. And the Christian pacifists I know, they're committed to a much larger project. It's not just about anti-war. It's about what else can we do to ensure that there are conditions of social justice so that people have enough to eat, so there's equality, so that people grow up educated, people grow up with opportunities. I mean, that all is connected with the Jesus idea of love your neighbor, you know, and love your enemy. Love your enemy doesn't mean just not fighting. Love your enemy means find ways to give them what they need. Can the government do it? I don't know. Maybe not. The government's committed to this military project. Maybe it takes some sort of alternative force, which if it's not politics, it's not very well with religion.
The only thing I can think of is that, like, Gandhi or Martin Luther King or someone to rise up out of the Islam from that environment, from that mentality, and I don't see anything that we're doing to make that even possible for anyone to do that, thinking those things, or just to have that in place.
Yeah, we need someone like that. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's us. You know, maybe it's not waiting. Maybe it's actually starting to talk more about this, be more active. Yeah.
So speaking of Christian pacifism, I was wondering what your thoughts were about the ironic association that was made after September 11th between this patriotic call to war and the pro-war ideology and the predominantly Christian conservative right side of the liberal spectrum.
Yeah. I mean, I'm in real trouble. We're talking about Jesus and George W. Bush. I'm worried about being quoted on some of this stuff. I was tempted to talk a bit in this talk about, you know, the famous Bush claim when he says that Jesus is my favorite political philosopher, and the kind of, I don't know, religious aspect of what's going on in the White House. I'm convinced that that's there, that there is a kind of conservative Christian voice that's heard in the White House. I didn't talk about any of that here. And one of the reasons I didn't talk about it was when you go back to understanding what the Bush Doctrine is about, those ideas are accepted by people who are not only conservative Christians. And again, the rhetoric that, even though, you know, President Bush sneaks in religious language every so often, the primary rhetorical toys that he's using, he talks about Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and the 20th century project of American history. Now, it has religious overtones, right? The idea here is that the United States is some gift from God that is going to lead the world towards freedom, democracy, etc. Religious overtones, yeah, but you can accept that narrative, the 20th century history narrative, without bringing religion in at all. And the president actually has done a pretty good job of articulating the narrative without bringing in the overt religious language. It's there. But he's not going around saying, well, I believe we're fighting the apocalyptic battle that was foretold in the book of Revelation. He doesn't say that. Thank God he doesn't say that, right? So yeah, I mean, that analysis is interesting, just as the analysis of is it a war for oil, what economic interests are there, that analysis is also interesting. But we need to look at the overt rationale, in part because most Americans, religious or not, accept the overt rationale, that we're the good guys in world history, right? We have an obligation to fight against the enemies of civilization. That unconditional surrender may be the only option because that's what we did in the Second World War. That's how Ronald Reagan won the Cold War. That large story can be told, I think, without bringing religion.
I have two related questions. It's said that we're in a war, and it's a war on terror. So the first problem is that we're fighting a war against a sovereign nation after declaring war on a tactic. And that's, those are two different kinds of wars. And one of them, a war on a tactic, is a war that can never end. And so that justification can be transferred over to a war on a sovereign nation. Then you never have to leave because you're not fighting the Iraqis. You're fighting a tactic which happens to be manifested in Iraq. So that's the first question. And the second question that relates to just war theory really is, the point of the first question is, how can just war theory relate to the war in Iraq when it's also being we're also being told that it's not a war in the traditional sense, it's a new kind of war. It's a 21st century war. It's a war on a tactic or on an adjective. And so the second question is, so is there a mismatch? The second question is, does just war theory have anything to say about who fights in a war? Because it's easier to go to war and have the war drag on year after year when you don't know anyone personally who's fighting in that war. You can be like, well, I'm really tired of these headlines, we really ought to get out of Iraq. I mean, that's not much of a motivation to change a policy. So does just war have anything to say about who participates in war and what kind of sacrifice is undertaken by the broadest swath of a population that goes to war?
Yeah, those are great questions. The second one, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. I don't know that there is an answer for that within just war theory. But one way you could, I mean, this isn't, I'm not speaking on behalf of just war theory here, but what you're seeing happening is that we have a mercenary army, in a way, that we hire professionals to go and do the fighting for us, which I think could fit with the sovereign's obligation understood in the just war idea that the sovereign is required to defend his people. One way to defend your people is to hire the best people to come in and fight for them. Right? Because if your people can't defend themselves or are not interested in defending themselves, maybe you go out and hire the professional army to do it. So I can imagine maybe just war theory would allow for this. But what I hear behind what you're saying is that we would take it a lot more seriously if we were asked to make some more substantial sacrifices. If there was a draft or something that spread the burden across the American populace.
Yeah,
oh, right.
People don't think critically because it's better than TV. It's because they have to think critically. They're forced to by their circumstances.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, just back to the statistics, I asked, does anyone know how many people have been killed in war on terrorism and all this? Most people have really no clue what's going on. It's in the newspaper every day, but you skip past it because, damn it, I'm tired of hearing about it. Right? In part because, as you suggest, nobody knows anyone fighting over there. It's not actually true for my students in Fresno. There's people who have brothers killed, but for the most part, still, it is a small portion of the population. Back to your first question about the war, war on an abstraction. I think that's right. There's a problem here. Talking about war on terrorism. What is terrorism, after all? It's a complicated story. I mean, there's books, dozens of books written. What is terrorism? It's a contentious question about what terrorism is. And yet, here's what I think our job is to take the rhetoric at face value. The war on terrorism seems to function as it has some meaning in our culture. Now, the job of the critical thinker is to ask what the meaning is, and what's the concrete details. It includes wars in Afghanistan and war in Iraq, at least. It probably includes some other things as well, such as what we're currently worried about, Iran, and so on. Those are connected somehow. Afghanistan and Iraq are connected somehow. connected by the rhetoric of the war on terrorism. But if you go back and think about the history of this again, you probably know some of this. Iraq invaded Kuwait, the United States and coalition forces invaded. There were American troops in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the Middle East. Sanctions against Iraq. In 1998, Osama bin Laden says, this is why Muslims must fight against the United States, because of the sanctions regime against Iraq, and because of the presence of American troops in the Middle East. So the Iraq question is tied to the Afghanistan question through Al-Qaeda, etc. It's quite a complicated story to play that out, right? And as you suggested in your second comment there, or maybe as I suggested in response, most people don't have the patience to go through that whole story to figure out how all this is connected. Instead, we talk about the war on terrorism. I don't know where I went with that. I just ran my way through Osama bin Laden. Yeah.
I really appreciate you being here today. I appreciate what you're talking about. I think that I've really heard some amazing questions about how to implement this kind of thinking and how to implement our ideas. One of the things that I know is that historically women have not been involved in this kind of decision making about just war. Certainly none of these theories have been written by women, and women have not really been involved in the discussion about these wars necessarily. We're not asking the Iraqi mothers and sisters and grandmothers and nor the mothers necessarily. If you look at Cindy Sheehan, for instance, the way that she's been treated as far as her opinions go. I'm wondering how you feel about the role of feminism in the future of developing war or just war or pacifist theory.
That's a whole other can of worms. There's this idea that if women were put in charge, there would be no more wars. Not saying that's what you're suggesting, but you've heard this or thought this at some point. Most of us have heard this. Is that true? I don't know. And one of the reasons I'm doubtful about that is that, I know my wife would fight tooth and nail to defend my children. Not just me. I mean, it's not just a man who's going to defend the house. It's women who fight in order to defend their children. I remember reading an article that's titled is On Your Shield or With It. It's a feminist response to just war theory. I can't remember the name of the author. But anyway, the author, the thesis is in ancient Spartan culture, the Spartan women would send their men off to war and say, you either come back in glory or don't come back at all. So Spartan mothers were proponents of this kind of hardcore war story. And then let me just take you back to my talk. Jean Bethke Elshtain, is a defender of the just war idea and a feminist. She called herself a feminist, and she's interested in women's issues. And one of her interests, I don't agree with Elshtain's book or ideas, by the way. One of her interests in connection between feminism and just war theory is she's worried about injustices done to women. And if you think about the way that war historically, currently is operated, men go and fight and abuse women as part of war activity. Rape as a weapon of war, right? We've seen this in Iraq where there was American service men raped a young girl. Or the way that when men go to war, they bring brothels with them, right? So there's a sex industry that accompanies war. And Elshtain's view on all this is to say, well, just war principles need to be applied properly, accurately, right? So rape cannot be a weapon of war, and war can actually be used to defend women's rights. That would be a long-winded way of saying there's a complicated answer to the story about feminism, but it's important to think about. Yeah.
If you were to call the war in Iraq just, what would be the method for justifying that? Like, what would be some ideas that you have on justifying that war? And then my second question is, Bush in his September 11, 2006 speech addressed the nation, and he said, if we don't fight in Iraq, they're just going to follow us home. How do you feel about fighting there versus fighting
Your first question is, what about the war in Iraq? Can it be just? I was opposed to the invasion of Iraq before we invaded. I worried that the weapons of mass destruction story was hyperbole and misinformation. I worried, using just war ideas, that a full-scale invasion of Iraq is disproportional to the aim, idea of proportionality. If we knew with their weapons, we could send commandos in and take care of the weapons, maybe. The radical regime change seems to be quite a whole other project. So the weapons of mass destruction story, I think, I'm skeptical about. The second story that was told, of course, not about weapons of mass destruction, but about democratization and human rights. That, to me, is the more plausible rationale for the war, if you want to say that one of the rationales was plausible. In part because, you know, at some point, there is good cause to fight to defend people against oppressive dictators. Do I think that that actually could have justified the war? No. I mean, that was the more plausible rationale, but again, I think there are probably non-violent means that could have been more productive. What was your second question?
If the war in Iraq is based on the war on terrorism, and I guess I have a big issue is why we're fighting over there if terrorists can follow us home. Because I feel like terrorism is going to be an ongoing issue with our culture and media and society and how it's progressed into a very violent society. And in Bush's speech, he said, well, if we don't fight there, they're going to follow us home. So who's to say that, you know, there won't be problems? I guess I just wanted to get your opinion.
Yeah, this requires some expertise in terms of terrorist methodology. But I have an opinion about it. I mean, I'm worried that that's just a rhetorical ploy. You know, fight over there so we don't have to fight here is in line with saying, well, we're fighting right now, so we should just keep fighting. I'm worried about that. It's kind of a justification of war that just goes on and on. We should keep fighting them over there forever so that they don't come and fight us here. I'm worried about that. It becomes kind of a circle of justification. On the other hand, I mean, because I've talked about this in different venues, no one said this today, but it's the case that maybe someone could raise their hand and say, wait a minute, it looks like the war on terrorism is actually working. Because since September 11, 2001, no one's attacked the United States homeland. I mean, that kind of objection, again, it requires a kind of expertise about terrorism and the way that terrorism functions in the world. Here's my analysis of what's going on in Iraq. I've never been there, not an expert in Iraqi politics, but it seems to me that the terrorists there are not interested in destroying American civilization, as President Bush claims they are. They're interested in, I don't know, concrete local events, getting control of the city, getting control of the province, having political power within Iraq. They're not interested in this great struggle of civilization that President Bush is talking about, I don't think. Again, that's just based on kind of general insight into human nature. Why would someone in a terrorist, so-called terrorist in Iraq, care to leave Iraq to come here if we weren't involved there in the first place? They're more interested probably in local politics, local power issues. Again, that's based on this sort of information.
Any other questions? So, thank you very much. We'll actually have a talk in the philosophy department tomorrow. Plaza M108 and Fiala will be talking about varieties and customs. It'll be 11:30.
Alternative, both subjectivity and sort of envision idealized society in the way you've described it, but there's continuities there. Or for example, in the Branch Davidians, there are certain overwhelming, a lot of overlapping areas with kind of mainline Protestant Christianity. So could you just talk about some of the ways in which they are related but yet become antithetical? And
it's actually easiest to do if I use historical, the relationship of the monastery to the larger church. The larger church defines itself in opposition to the world, however that's defined, the Roman Empire. So the church is the ascetic. In relationship to the Roman Empire, the church is an ascetical discipline. The monks define themselves in opposition to the church, which defines itself in opposition to the... So in relationship to the church, a monastery is an ascetical discipline. A hermit who goes to live outside of the monastery is defining himself in opposition to a monk living in community who defines himself in opposition to the church, which defines itself in opposition to the world. So that there are in all of those commonalities. But the minute you begin to define yourself in opposition to is when you begin to think ascetically. The minute you begin to do there was probably a formative practice related to how you became a Christian or a member of that community at each level that was the same across everyone, whether you were a hermit or a bishop of a diocese. So those formative processes would have been similar, but asceticism kicks in at the point at which the alternative is beginning to be defined. And that's a scale. Yes, there are parts of what the Branch Davidians did that actually is directly related to what a lot of stuff you read on the net. If you go surfing for, religious sites on the net, you'll see the same stuff. The difference is that they weren't, that in that place, that they're really not necessarily trying to guide a person into an alternative subjectivity to the degree that the Waco community, Branch Davidians did.
We have some students, and probably faculty members too, who have to go to a 2:30 class. So let's continue our discussion afterwards, and we have food and refreshments. But let's all thank Professor Valentazzi.
Well, I was just going to say, I know this would never happen. You found yourself on judges' commission terrorists. What would you advise?
No, I'm serious. Demonization is solving a problem.
Right.
And so the formation needs to happen in the military and that. You don't. I don't know that you don't.
I think there's some in there. Yeah, if it's not on, just push the button, turn the green light on.
Automatically define yourself as the other, the oppressor. Even people support it.